In 1990, a geologist from Boston University stood in front of the Great Sphinx of Giza and realized something was deeply wrong. The erosion on the body of the Sphinx, deep vertical channels carved into the limestone, could only have been made by one thing: heavy rainfall, prolonged biblical rainfall. And the problem is that the Sahara has not seen that kind of rain since at least 5000 BCE, which means the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is potentially twice that age or older. And if it is, then someone built it. Someone with the knowledge, the organization, and the power to carve a monument that massive in a civilization that history says did not yet exist. How rock weathers over time, and when he examined the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the U-shaped trench carved into the bedrock from which the Sphinx itself was freed, he saw something that no amount of wind, no amount of sand, no conventional explanation could account for. The erosion was vertical. It ran in deep, undulating channels from the top of the enclosure walls downward. And that pattern, in geology, has one cause: rain. Specifically, the kind of sustained heavy rainfall that saturates stone over centuries and carves it from above. The kind of rainfall that has not fallen on the Giza Plateau in any significant quantity for at least 7,000 years. Schock conducted seismic surveys around the base of the Sphinx. He sent sound waves into the bedrock and measured how deep the weathering extended beneath the surface. What he found was that the subsurface weathering on three sides of the Sphinx enclosure averaged between 1.8 and 2.5 meters deep. For that level of weathering to have occurred in the 4,500 years since the conventional construction date, the desert would have needed rainfall it simply never received. The data pointed to a much older structure. Schock's conclusion, presented to the Geological Society of America in 1991, was that the core body of the Sphinx had to date to somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE at the earliest, and possibly much further back than that. The Egyptological establishment reacted with fury. Zahi Hawass, then the most powerful voice in Egyptian archaeology, dismissed the claim outright. Mark Lanner, one of the foremost Sphinx experts in the world, argued that the weathering could be explained by other factors: quarry marks, wind abrasion, post-construction environmental exposure. He pointed out that no artifacts, no settlements, no evidence of any kind had been found at Giza, suggesting the presence of an advanced civilization capable of carving the Sphinx before the 4th dynasty. And he was right about that. No such artifacts have been confirmed. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the stone itself, the oldest eyewitness to whatever happened on that plateau, tells a story that the conventional timeline simply cannot explain away. Here is what makes this more than a geological argument. Here is what turns it from an academic dispute about weathering profiles into something far more unsettling. Because if the Sphinx is older than we think, if it was carved by hands that lived and worked and planned and organized in a civilization we have no record of, then we have to ask where those people came from, what they knew, what they believed, and whether they left anything behind when they went. And to answer those questions, you cannot look only at the stone. You have to look at the writing. You have to look at what the Egyptians themselves said in their own words, inscribed on their own walls, about who came before them. And what those texts describe will challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. The Egyptians called their hieroglyphs Mdiju Netcher, the words of the gods, not the words of scribes, not the words of kings, the words of gods. This was not poetic language. This was a cosmological statement about where the writing itself came from. The ancient Egyptians believed, with total conviction, that their writing system had not been invented by human beings. It had been given to them, transmitted to them by divine beings who had existed in Egypt long before any human civilization had taken shape. The god credited with this transmission was Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of writing, knowledge, and cosmic order. But Thoth himself was not the origin. He was the messenger. The knowledge he carried came from something older, something that had walked the earth during a period the Egyptians called, by a name that translates, simply and devastatingly, as the first time: Zep Tepi. Those two words appear again and again in the oldest Egyptian religious texts. They appear in the pyramid texts, which are carved on the interior walls of pyramids at Saqqara, and are the oldest religious writings that have ever been found anywhere on earth. They appear in the coffin texts. They appear in temple inscriptions, spanning thousands of years of Egyptian history. And every time they appear, they are describing the same thing: a remote, primordial period before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, before human civilization in Egypt had even begun, when divine beings ruled the land directly and personally. The British Egyptologist Rundle T. Clark, one of the most respected scholars of Egyptian mythology in the 20th century, described Zep Tepi as the epoch during which the basic principles of life, nature, and society were determined by the gods long before the establishment of kingship. He was not speaking loosely. He was summarizing what the texts themselves explicitly state. What the texts say about this period is extraordinary. They describe a golden age in which the waters of a great primordial abyss receded, in which darkness was banished, and in which humanity, emerging into light for the first time, was given the gifts of civilization. Architecture, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, writing, all of it, according to the Egyptian texts, was not discovered by human beings through a slow, painful process of trial and error. All of it was given, transmitted deliberately by beings who already possessed it in full, complete form. Beings the texts call the Neteru. The Neteru are not gods in the way we typically use that word. The Egyptian term Netjer, written in hieroglyphs as a wrapped pole bearing a flag, a symbol that appears in pre-dynastic contexts before the writing system was even fully developed, did not mean divine in the purely supernatural sense. It described a category of being that was distinct from humanity, powerful, yes, capable of things humans could not do, yes, but also physical, present, walking the earth, ruling cities, building structures, passing down knowledge through direct instruction and demonstration. The pyramid texts describe the Neteru as beings who possessed the ability to appear as men or women, as animals, as birds, as plants. They were shapeshifters. They were intermediaries between what we might call the divine order of the cosmos and the material world that human beings inhabit. And according to every Egyptian text that touches on the subject, they were here first. They are described in the pyramid texts as beings of light, radiant, capable of illuminating the darkness around them. They are described as extraordinarily tall, a detail that appears in multiple textual traditions across the ancient Near East. They are associated with specific animals, not as totems or symbols, but as actual alternative forms they were capable of inhabiting. Horus takes the form of a falcon. Thoth takes the form of an ibis or a baboon. Anubis takes the form of a jackal. The texts do not present these transformations as metaphor. They present them as biological fact. Whatever the Neteru were, the Egyptians who recorded their existence were certain of one thing: they were not like us. But the Neteru were not the only beings described. There was another category, a third order that sits between the full gods of the earliest age and the mortal human pharaohs of the historical dynasties. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because this third category is not found only in myth. It is found in an official historical document, a record that the Egyptian state itself compiled, preserved, and treated as an authoritative account of their own history. And what it records about the rulers who came before the pharaohs is something that mainstream scholarship has never quite known what to do with. The document is called the Turin King List, also known as the Turin Papyrus or the Royal Canon of Turin. It is currently held in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, and it dates to the reign of Rameses II, the 19th dynasty, roughly 1279 to 1213 BCE. It was commissioned as an administrative record, a comprehensive, authoritative list of every ruler of Egypt from the very beginning to the time of its composition. And it is structured in a way that reveals exactly how the ancient Egyptians understood their own deep history. The list is divided into three categories. First, the gods, divine beings who ruled Egypt directly and physically. Second, a group described as demigods and semi-divine spirits. Third, the human dynasties, the pharaohs we recognize, beginning with Menes, the first mortal king. But it is the first two categories that should stop you completely. The Turin Papyrus records that before the first human pharaoh ever sat on a throne, Egypt was governed by a succession of divine rulers. The list begins with Ptah, the creator god, the god of craft and architecture and the shaping of the physical world. After Ptah came Ra, then Shu, Geb, Osiris, Seth, and Horus, the great gods of the Egyptian pantheon, ruling not from the heavens but from the earth itself in a sequence that the papyrus presents not as mythology but as history, complete with reign durations measured precisely in years and months. The combined rule of these divine kings, according to the calculations contained in the papyrus, lasted approximately 12,300 years. Then comes the transitional period, a second group of divine rulers, less clearly identified, who governed for approximately 1,500 years in what the texts describe as the space between divine rule and human rule. And then, the third category, the ones who are neither god nor human, the ones the Turin Papyrus calls the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, sometimes translated as the companions of Horus, sometimes rendered as the Shining Ones. The papyrus records them as rulers who governed Egypt for a combined period of approximately 13,400 years. Not years as a metaphor, years as a historical measurement recorded in the same format. Years, months, days, used for the human pharaohs listed elsewhere in the same document. The Turin Papyrus treats their reigns as real administrative history, and what the papyrus says about them, What little it actually says, because the descriptions are frustratingly sparse, is that they were neither fully divine nor fully human. They occupied a category in between. They were the inheritors of the knowledge of the gods, the keepers of the sacred understanding established during Zep Tepi, and they ruled Egypt for millennia before the first mortal king drew breath. The Palermo stone confirms their existence independently. The Palermo stone is a fragment of a larger basalt slab inscribed with a king list during the 5th dynasty, centuries earlier than the Turin papyrus, and it also records the Shemsu Hor, placing them in the same position in Egyptian history, the rulers who governed between the age of the gods and the age of human pharaohs. Two separate official documents, composed centuries apart by different hands in different eras, both record the same category of pre-human ruler. The Egyptians were not confused about this. They were not speaking loosely or mythologically. They were recording what they genuinely and consistently believed to be the factual history of their civilization. The mainstream Egyptological response to this is consistent and, in its way, understandable. Scholars argue that these entries represent a literary convention, a way of expressing the divine legitimacy of the pharaonic line by tracing it back to the gods themselves. They argue that the extraordinarily long reign durations are mythological in nature, borrowed from a storytelling tradition that also appears in the Sumerian king list, where pre-flood rulers are recorded as having reigned for tens of thousands of years. They argue that the Egyptians used the deep past as sacred narrative architecture, not as literal history. And they may be right. That interpretation is defensible. It is coherent. But it requires dismissing the Egyptians' own account of their history without any direct evidence that the account is fabricated. It requires assuming that an advanced, literate civilization demonstrating extraordinary precision in astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and record-keeping was simply inventing its early history in a way that has no parallel in how they recorded anything else. And here is what makes that assumption increasingly difficult to sustain. Because in 1994, 12,000 kilometers from the Giza Plateau in the arid limestone hills of southeastern Turkey near a city called Şanlıurfa, archaeologists began excavating a site that would force a fundamental reassessment of when complex human civilization actually began. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and what lay beneath that hill was something the academic world had declared was impossible. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive stone circles, T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them standing more than 5.5 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 tons, arranged in concentric rings, carved with extraordinary reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, vultures, scorpions, as well as abstract symbols in humanoid forms. The pillars were dressed, they were precisely shaped, they were positioned with clear intentionality and aligned with celestial events, and radiocarbon dating placed their construction at approximately 9600 BCE, nearly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,500 years before the pyramids of Giza, at a time when, according to the standard model of human prehistory, the people of this region were nomadic hunter-gatherers without agriculture, without settled communities, without any of the social organization normally considered necessary for monument construction on this scale. The existence of Göbekli Tepe does not prove that an advanced civilization built the Sphinx. It does not validate the Turin Papyrus's account of divine pre-dynastic rulers. But it does something almost as significant. It proves that the standard timeline of human civilization, the comfortable linear narrative in which complexity develops slowly and predictably from primitive beginnings, is wrong. Hunter-gatherers built Göbekli Tepe. People without writing, without pottery, without agriculture, carved and erected and precisely positioned 20-ton limestone pillars in a complex so sophisticated it required coordinated labor across multiple generations. Something motivated them to do it. Something organized them. And that something, whatever it was, preceded everything we normally think of as civilization by thousands of years. Dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian iconography, thousands of years after the Karahan Tepe figures were carved. This is not a general similarity. This is a specific, highly unusual form of symbolic representation appearing in two places, geographically distant and temporally separated by millennia. And it sits in a broader pattern of correspondence that grows harder to dismiss as coincidence the more carefully you examine it. In 2024, a study published in a peer-reviewed academic journal by Dr. Martin Sweatman argued that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had carved a lunisolar calendar into the stone, 12 lunar months plus 11 additional days to track the solar year. If that interpretation holds, it would be the oldest known calendar in human history, and it was made by people whose civilization, by the standard account, should not have been sophisticated enough to require one. Now bring all of this back to Egypt, back to the sand, back to the question that the Sphinx has been silently asking for however many thousands of years it has stood there facing the rising sun. The Egyptian texts do not describe divine beings from a remote golden age in vague, poetic terms. They describe specific things those beings did, specific knowledge they transmitted. The pyramid texts, those oldest surviving religious writings, carved on the interior walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids at Saqqara, describe the cosmos in terms of astonishing precision. The god Osiris is identified with the constellation Orion. The goddess Isis is identified with Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose heliacal rising, its first appearance on the horizon before dawn after a period of invisibility, coincided with the annual flooding of the Nile. These were not decorative mythological associations. They were precise astronomical observations, encoded in religious language and preserved permanently in stone. The pyramid texts also describe, repeatedly and in detail, the soul's journey through the cosmos after death, a journey mapped against the actual positions of stars and constellations, with an accuracy that requires sustained, sophisticated astronomical observation over very long periods of time. You do not develop that kind of knowledge overnight. You do not develop it in a few generations. Astronomical traditions of the precision evident in the earliest Egyptian religious texts require centuries, possibly millennia, of careful observation and meticulous record-keeping, which raises a question that no one has yet satisfactorily answered. Where did that knowledge come from? When did the observation begin? Who was watching the stars before the first dynasty, before the pre-dynastic cultures at Naqada, before any human settlement at Giza that archaeology has been able to confirm? The Egyptians knew the answer, or believed they did. They wrote it on their walls. The knowledge came from the Netru. It was preserved and transmitted by the Shemsu Hor. It was passed down through the institution of sacred kingship, which the texts describe as a direct continuation of the divine rule established during Zep Tepi. The pharaohs were not kings who happened to claim divine descent as a convenient political strategy. They were, in the Egyptian understanding, the final link in an unbroken chain of authority that stretched all the way back to the first time, to a period when the foundational principles of civilization were laid down by beings who are no longer here. And then there is the question of what is still buried. Because the sand does not give up its secrets easily, and there's a great deal of sand, the 3 tunnels confirmed by Egyptologists beneath the Great Sphinx are real. Their full extent and purpose remain disputed. Seismic surveys conducted in the 1990s suggested the presence of additional cavities beneath the Sphinx and in the surrounding bedrock, though Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to permit comprehensive subsurface investigation of the kind that might resolve the question definitively. The Giza Plateau has been excavated for well over a century, and it continues to yield surprises. In recent decades, discoveries of workers' villages, administrative buildings, and harbor infrastructure have radically transformed our understanding of how the pyramid complex functioned. And yet the plateau almost certainly contains structures and deposits that have not yet been reached. This is the fundamental nature of Egypt. It is a country built on layers. Every generation of archaeologists has found things beneath the things that the previous generation thought were the bottom. The desert is deep and patient, and it holds what it holds until someone with the right tools and the right questions arrives to ask it. What makes the story of the beings described in the hieroglyphs so persistent, so resistant to dismissal, so capable of surviving decades of scholarly debunking, is not that it proves the existence of a lost civilization. It does not. The evidence for that remains circumstantial, suggestive, and contested. What makes it so persistent is that it is the Egyptians themselves who are making the claim, not modern speculators, not alternative historians with books to sell. The people who built the Sphinx, who composed the pyramid texts, who commissioned the Turin Papyrus, who maintained an unbroken religious and administrative tradition for 3,000 years. Those people believed, consistently and with absolute seriousness, that their civilization had not originated with themselves, that it had been given to them, that before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, before any human ruler sat on the throne of the 2 lands, beings of a fundamentally different order had been here. The Shemsu Hor left the land. The texts are clear on that point. Whatever they were, divine, semi-divine, human with extraordinary inherited knowledge, or something else entirely, they did not remain. The Turin Papyrus records their departure from the historical record as matter-of-factly as it records the succession from one human pharaoh to the next. They were here, then they were not. And in their absence, the first mortal king, Menes, unified Upper and Lower Egypt and began the dynastic era. An era that, for all its extraordinary achievements, was in the Egyptian understanding a diminishment from what came before, a stepping down from the Golden Age, a world abandoned by the gods. Robert Schoch is still working. He is still publishing. His most recent research has expanded beyond the Sphinx to examine what he describes as evidence of massive ancient plasma discharge events at Giza, lightning strikes of extraordinary scale, possibly connected to an atmospheric catastrophe around 9700 BCE. which he argues may have destroyed the civilization responsible for the Sphinx and other structures whose true age we have not correctly identified. The mainstream academic world continues to reject his conclusions. The argument remains ongoing, unresolved, and likely to stay that way until the subsurface of the Giza Plateau is open to comprehensive investigation, or some other form of evidence emerges that settles the question permanently. What we are left with, in the meantime, is the stone and the writing. The Sphinx, eroded in ways that demand a real explanation. The hieroglyphs, which the Egyptians themselves called the words of the gods. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings on earth, describing divine beings in a golden age before human history began. The Turin Papyrus, an official administrative document listing non-human rulers governing Egypt for tens of thousands of years before the first mortal pharaoh. The Palermo stone, confirming the same account from a different dynasty, a different century, a different hand. Göbekli Tepe, proving that sophisticated, organized, intentional human activity existed 9,000 years before the Common Era, in a form that our standard models cannot adequately explain. Consider what it would mean for a moment if the Egyptians were telling the truth. Not in some vague spiritual sense, but literally. If the Turin Papyrus is a genuine historical record rather than a literary device, then human civilization on the Nile Valley did not begin with the pre-dynastic Naqada cultures of the 4th millennium BCE. It began tens of thousands of years earlier, under rulers whose nature we cannot yet define. That is a revision of human history so fundamental that most academics will not entertain it because the implications cascade in every direction, into archaeology, into genetics, into our understanding of what humanity is and where it came from. But dismissing it requires deciding that the Egyptians were lying about their own past. And there is no evidence that they were. None of this constitutes proof of what the Egyptians claimed, but all of it, taken together, makes a compelling and genuinely serious case that the history of human civilization is considerably stranger, considerably longer, and considerably more mysterious than the version most of us were taught. Something happened before Egypt, something organized, something capable. Something that looked up at the same stars we see tonight with enough knowledge and enough precision to encode its observations in writing systems and astronomical alignments that have outlasted it by thousands of years, and somewhere under the sand of the Giza Plateau, in cavities that have not yet been opened, in layers of sediment that no shovel has yet reached. But there may be answers. There may be records. There may be whatever the Shemsu Hor, the Shining Ones, the followers of Horus, whatever they truly were, left behind when they departed and never returned. The Sphinx is still watching the eastern horizon. It has been watching for far longer than we currently know, and it has been waiting with infinite patience for someone to finally ask the right question.